Say that again, Daniel Whitmore said quietly, his voice no longer carrying the easy confidence that had filled the table just moments before. An hour earlier, the room had belonged to him. Crystal glasses chimed. Low laughter moved like a current through the private dining space. A Manhattan night, polished and expensive, measured in tailored suits and $1,000 watches. Daniel sat at the center, relaxed, untouchable, the kind of man who didn't need to raise his voice to be heard. People leaned in anyway. He liked it that way. Control didn't come from volume. It came from certainty. And tonight, like so many nights before, he entertained himself the same way he always did. Not with stories, not with jokes, but with questions. Simple ones, he would say, smiling just enough to soften the edge. Questions designed to reveal how quickly people folded under pressure, how easily they exposed what they didn't know. It was a game, one he had never lost, until she walked up to the table. Emily Carter didn't interrupt. She didn't rush. She moved with quiet efficiency, setting down a glass of water beside him with a steady hand. No hesitation, no performance, just presence. Sparkling or still? She asked. Her voice was calm, neutral, the kind of voice that didn't ask for attention. Daniel barely looked up at first. Another server. Another face in a uniform that blurred into the background. Sparkling, he said, still scanning the messages on his phone. But something subtle, made him glance up a second time. Maybe it was the way she didn't linger, didn't hover, didn't wait for approval. She had already turned, already moving to the next guest, as if his answer had been expected, not granted. He watched her for a second longer than necessary. Then he smiled. Not because of her, because he had found his next question. Miss, he called out, just loud enough for the table to shift its attention. Conversations paused. Forks hovered midair. The room, as always, followed his lead. Emily stopped, turned, walked back without hurry. No visible reaction. Yes, sir, she said. Daniel leaned back in his chair, one arm resting casually along the backrest, posture. Loose but deliberate. Let's try something, he said, the corner of his mouth lifting. A quick question, just for fun. A few guests chuckled. They knew this routine. They had seen it before. Emily didn't smile, didn't frown either. She just waited. If you had to choose, Daniel continued, his tone light, almost playful, what's more valuable? Something everyone believes is true, or something that actually is? A pause. A small one. Just enough to create tension. The kind he enjoyed. Around the table, people exchanged looks. Some already forming answers in their heads. Some already unsure. Daniel watched her closely now, waiting for the flicker, the hesitation, the moment where confidence cracks. It always came. It always did. But Emily didn't answer. Not right away. Instead, she tilted her head just slightly, studying him. Not the question. Him. May I ask something first? She said. The room shifted. Subtle. Almost invisible. Daniel's smile held. But something behind it paused. Go ahead, he said. Still relaxed. Still certain. She nodded once. Are you asking as someone who wants to know the truth? She said softly. Or as someone who wants to prove they already do? Silence. Not loud. Not dramatic. Just still. For the first time that evening, Daniel didn't speak immediately. His fingers, resting lightly on the table, stopped tapping. The question hadn't been answered. It had been moved. And somehow, without raising her voice, without changing her tone, she had taken control of the conversation. Daniel's smile did not disappear, but it changed. It stayed on his face the way a reflection stays on glass, present but no longer alive. Around the table, no one spoke. The earlier laughter had nowhere to land. It simply faded. He leaned forward slightly, elbows now resting on the table, his posture no longer casual but measured. Studying her. Recalculating. That is not an answer, he said, his voice even, controlled, as if restoring order to something that had slipped. Emily did not move. She did not look away either. It depends on the question, she replied. No edge. No challenge in her tone. Just clarity. A few guests shifted in their seats. One man cleared his throat, as if preparing to laugh again, then stopped when no one joined him. Daniel noticed. Of course he noticed. He always noticed the room. But this time, the room was not following him. It was watching him. A subtle difference. A dangerous one. All right, he said after a brief pause, straightening slightly. Let me make it simpler for you. He folded his hands together, fingers interlaced, the gesture calm but deliberate. Truth exists. Belief is just perception. So the obvious answer is truth. That is what has real value. He glanced around the table, inviting agreement. A few nods came, hesitant, like people stepping onto uncertain ground. Then his eyes returned to her. Now, he said, your answer. Emily let the silence sit for a moment. Not long. Just enough. If truth always had more value, she said softly, you would not need to ask the question in front of an audience. The words landed without force. And yet, they stayed. Daniel blinked once. A small movement, almost invisible, but his fingers tightened slightly against each other. Explain, he said, still calm. But now there was something else beneath it. Not anger. Not yet. Something closer to curiosity. Or resistance. Emily nodded once, as if acknowledging the request, not submitting to it. If truth was enough, she continued, you would ask privately. Because truth does not need witnesses. A pause. No one interrupted. But belief, she added, does. The air in the room shifted again. This time, no one tried to fill it. Daniel leaned back slowly, his chair making the faintest sound against the floor. His eyes remained on her, but the certainty behind them had begun to fracture, not visibly, not in a way most people would recognize, but enough. Enough for him to feel it. So you are saying, he said carefully, that I asked this question to what? Impress people? Emily shook her head once. I am saying, she replied, that the value of your question depends on why you needed to ask it out loud. That was it. No accusation. No raised voice. Just a mirror, held up without comment. Around the table, the silence deepened. It was no longer awkward. It was attentive, focused, waiting. Daniel's gaze flickered, just for a second, to the others. They were not nodding anymore. Not smiling. Just watching. And for the first time that evening, Daniel Whitmore did not immediately have the next move. Daniel did not respond immediately. He reached for his glass instead, lifting it halfway before setting it back down untouched. A small motion, but enough to reveal hesitation. The kind that did not belong to him. Not here. Not in this room. He exhaled slowly through his nose, eyes still locked on Emily, as if recalibrating something internal, something that had always worked before and now did not. You are making assumptions, he said finally. His tone was steady again, but it required effort now. That much was clear to anyone paying attention. Emily nodded once, accepting the statement without resistance. Of course, she said. We all do. No defense. No apology. Just acknowledgement. Daniel leaned forward again, this time more deliberately, reclaiming space, reclaiming posture. Then let me clarify, he said. I asked a question. A simple one. You turned it into something else. He paused, letting the words settle. Why? The question hung between them, but it felt different now. Less like a trap. More like a request he did not fully control. Emily glanced briefly at the table. Not at the faces. At the space itself. The untouched plates. The glasses. The stillness that had replaced noise. Then she looked back at him. Because it was not a simple question, she said. It just sounded like one. A man at the far end of the table shifted in his seat, crossing his arms slowly, his attention sharpening. Daniel noticed that too. He always noticed the smallest changes. But this time, those changes were not aligning in his favor. Explain that, he said. Emily took a breath, not to prepare, but to pace the moment. A simple question seeks an answer, she said. Yours sought a reaction. The words did not rise. They settled. Like weight. Daniel's jaw tightened just slightly. And you believe you know my intention? He asked. There it was. A flicker. Not anger. Not yet. But something closer to being seen when he had not chosen to be. Emily did not look impressed. She did not look intimidated either. She just looked certain. I believe, she said, that people rarely ask questions in rooms like this unless they already have a role assigned for the answer. No one moved. Even the servers in the distance seemed to slow, as if the air itself had thickened. Daniel let out a quiet breath, almost a laugh, but without humor. So what role did you think I assigned to you? He asked. The question came quicker now, sharper, but it lacked the earlier ease. Emily did not answer immediately. She let the silence return, not as tension, as space. Then she spoke. The one where I fail quickly, she said, so you could succeed visibly. The sentence was soft, but it did not bend. Around the table, something shifted again. Not sound, not movement, recognition. Daniel leaned back once more, slower this time, his gaze dropping for a fraction of a second before returning to her. That fraction mattered. It was the first break. And instead, he asked quietly. Emily placed the check presenter gently on the table, aligning it with the edge, precise, unhurried. Instead, she said, "You are still asking." The words stayed in the air long after she finished speaking. Not because they were loud, but because they left nowhere else to go. Daniel looked at the check, then back at her. For a moment, the room did not belong to him anymore. It belonged to the silence she had created. And for the first time in a very long time, Daniel Whitmore understood something he had never needed to consider before. Not every question is a test. Some are mirrors. Daniel did not reach for the check. Not yet. His hand hovered near the edge of the table, then pulled back slowly, as if the simple act of picking it up required more certainty than he currently had. Around him, the room remained still, but it was no longer the kind of stillness that waited for him. It was the kind that watched. He glanced at the others again, more deliberately this time. No one was smiling. No one was offering the quiet reinforcement he was used to. Their expressions were neutral, but their attention was no longer aligned with him. It had shifted, subtly, completely. He turned back to Emily. "You speak like you have done this before," he said. The words were not an accusation. They were closer to observation. Emily's expression did not change. "No," she replied. "Not like this." A small pause. Then, "But people do not change as much as they think." Daniel let out a quiet breath, something between a sigh and a restrained laugh. "So now I am predictable?" he asked. Emily shook her head slightly. "No," she said. "Just consistent." The distinction landed. Daniel's jaw shifted as if he considered pushing back, but the argument did not come. Not because he could not find one, but because it would not land the same way anymore. Not here. Not now. He leaned back again, this time allowing the chair to settle fully beneath him. His posture relaxed, but not in control. In acceptance. "And what exactly am I consistent about?" he asked, his tone quieter now, stripped of the earlier performance. Emily's gaze did not waver. "You turn uncertainty into a stage," she said. "So you never have to sit in it alone." The words did not accuse. They revealed. Around the table, one of the guests shifted again, uncrossing his arms, leaning forward just slightly, as if drawn into something he had not expected to witness. Daniel noticed that too. He always noticed. But this time, it did not give him advantage. It confirmed something else. Something he could not redirect. He looked down at the table for a brief second, at the glass he had not touched, at the reflection of the overhead light in its surface. Then he looked back at her. "And you?" he asked. "You are comfortable with uncertainty?" Emily did not answer immediately. She placed a small receipt beside the check presenter, aligning it with the same careful precision as before. "No," she said finally. "I just do not need an audience to handle it." The difference settled between them. Clear. Unavoidable. Daniel's fingers tapped once against the table, then stopped. He looked at her, not as a server now, not as a participant in his game, but as something else. Someone who had stepped outside the frame he had created and refused to step back in. "You could have just answered the question," he said, quieter still. Emily gave a small nod. "Yes," she said. But then nothing would have changed. Silence followed. Not heavy, not uncomfortable, just honest. For the first time that night, Daniel did not try to fill it. He reached for the check then, slowly, not as a gesture of control, as a conclusion. But before opening it, he paused, looked at her one more time. "And now?" he asked. Emily met his gaze, calm as before. "Now," she said, "you have a better question." He held her gaze for a moment longer, then gave a small nod. Not agreement, not surrender, something quieter, something real. And when he finally opened the check, it was not the amount that made him pause. It was the realization that for once, the cost had nothing to do with money. Daniel closed the check presenter, but his hand remained resting on it, fingers lightly pressed against the leather as if anchoring himself to something tangible. The number inside did not matter. It never had. He had signed checks larger than this without looking twice. But this one felt different. Not heavier, just clearer. Across from him, Emily had already shifted her attention slightly, not away from him, but no longer fixed on him either. As if the moment had completed its purpose. As if she did not need anything more from it. That unsettled him more than the conversation itself. "Wait," he said, not loudly, but enough to hold her there. She paused, turned back. Same posture, same calm. "Yes, sir?" she asked. The title sounded neutral. Not deferential, not dismissive, just accurate. Daniel studied her for a moment, longer than before, but this time without calculation, without strategy. "What would you have answered?" he asked. "If I had asked it differently." The question came slower now, measured, not as a test, as a genuine gap he had not noticed before. Emily considered it, not immediately, not performatively, just enough to respect the question. "If you asked to understand," she said, "I would have said that truth and belief do not compete." Daniel's brow shifted slightly. "They do not?" he asked. She shook her head. "No," she said. "Truth exists. Belief decides what people are willing to do with it." The distinction settled into the space between them. Quiet. Precise. Daniel leaned back slightly, absorbing it. Not reacting. Processing. "So belief still matters," he said. "More than most people admit," she replied. "Especially in rooms like this." Her eyes moved briefly across the table, then returned to him. No judgment. Just observation. Daniel followed her glance for a second. The same people. The same room. But something had shifted in how he saw it. The confidence, the agreement, the subtle nods he had always relied on. They were not certainty. They were alignment. And alignment, he realized, could be influenced. Or lost. He looked back at her. "And what about you?" he asked. "What do you believe?" Emily did not answer right away. She adjusted the edge of a napkin that had slipped slightly out of place, a small movement, precise and quiet. Then she met his gaze again. "I believe," she said, "that how you ask a question tells people more about you than the answer ever will." The words did not echo. They did not need to. They stayed exactly where they were spoken. Daniel exhaled slowly, a breath that carried something unfamiliar. Not defeat, not frustration, something closer to recognition. He gave a small nod, almost to himself. "That is fair," he said. The admission was quiet, but it was real. He reached for a pen then, opening the check again, signing his name in a smooth, practiced motion. But when he finished, he did not slide it away immediately. Instead, he added something beneath it. Not a number, a word. He closed the presenter and pushed it slightly toward her. "Thank you," he said. The words were simple, unembellished, but they landed differently than anything he had said that evening. Emily picked up the check, her eyes briefly scanning it before closing it again. There was no visible reaction to what he had written, just a small nod. "You are welcome," she said. Then she turned and walked away, the same steady pace, the same quiet presence. Daniel watched her go for a moment, not with curiosity now, but with something steadier. Respect, perhaps, or something close to it. Around the table, the silence began to soften, conversations returning slowly, carefully, as if no one wanted to disturb what had just happened. Daniel leaned back in his chair, his hand now empty, resting lightly on the table. He did not reach for his phone, did not reclaim the room. He simply sat there for a moment longer, in the space she had left behind. And for the first time that night, he did not feel the need to fill it. The conversation around the table slowly returned, but it no longer carried the same rhythm. The laughter was softer now, the pauses a little longer. Daniel noticed it without trying to. Not because he was looking for control again, but because something in him had shifted from directing the room to observing it. He sat there, hands resting lightly on the table, no phone in sight, no urgency to move. Across the room, Emily moved between tables with the same quiet precision, as if nothing significant had happened. Orders taken, glasses refilled, a small nod here, a brief smile there. She did not look back at him. She did not need to. One of the guests across from Daniel leaned forward slightly. "That was unexpected," he said, his tone careful, almost testing the space again. Daniel glanced at him, then at the others. A few of them avoided his eyes. Not out of discomfort, out of thought. They were still processing. "It was accurate," Daniel said simply. The response came without hesitation, but also without performance. The man nodded slowly, surprised by the lack of deflection. "You are taking that well," another guest added, half smiling, as if trying to reintroduce the familiar dynamic. Daniel considered that for a moment. "I am taking it correctly," he replied. The distinction was subtle, but it landed. The table fell quiet again, Not because they expected him to speak more, but because they realized he would not. Not in the same way as before. Daniel leaned back slightly, his gaze drifting once more toward the far side of the room, where Emily was placing a plate in front of another guest. She listened as the man spoke, nodding once, adjusting something on the table, then stepping away. Efficient, composed, unchanged. He found himself wondering, briefly, how many conversations like theirs she had walked away from without carrying them with her. How many people had tried to define her role before realizing she had already stepped outside of it. The thought did not frustrate him. It grounded him. He looked down at the table again, at the empty glass, the folded napkin, the small details he had ignored earlier. The environment had not changed. Only his attention had. "Daniel," someone said, pulling him back. "We still need your thoughts on the expansion proposal." The words were familiar. The expectation behind them even more so. Normally, he would have answered immediately, directed the conversation, reclaimed the center. But this time he paused. Not because he did not have an answer, because he was choosing how to respond. He leaned forward slightly, resting his hands together, not as a signal of authority, but of focus. "Let us hear everyone else first," he said. The table stilled again. This time, it was not uncertainty. It was surprise. A small one, but real. One by one, the others began to speak, offering thoughts, perspectives, ideas. Some more confident than others. Some more tentative. Daniel listened, not waiting for his turn, not preparing a correction, just listening. Across the room, Emily passed by once more, her path taking her near the table but not toward it. For a brief second, their eyes met. No words, no gestures, just acknowledgement. Then she continued on. Daniel did not call her back. He did not need to. The moment had already done its work. He leaned back in his chair again, but this time, the posture was different. Not detached, not dominant, present. And as the conversation around him continued, he realized something quietly, almost without noticing when the thought had formed. Control had always been easy, but understanding required something else. Something he had not practiced until now. And for the first time in a long time, he was willing to stay in the room long enough to learn it. The discussion continued, but it no longer revolved around Daniel. Ideas moved across the table in a different pattern now, less like a performance and more like an exchange. Someone disagreed openly. Another refined the point instead of deferring. The rhythm was slower, but it carried more weight. Daniel noticed the difference immediately, not as a loss of control, but as a shift in structure. He leaned forward slightly, listening as one of the younger executives spoke, his voice steady but cautious, as if expecting interruption that never came. Daniel did not interrupt. He nodded once when the point landed, not to approve, but to acknowledge. It was a small gesture, but it changed the tone of the room again. Across the table, the same guest who had tried to lighten the moment earlier now spoke more carefully, choosing his words with more intention. No one was trying to impress anymore. They were trying to be understood. Daniel let his gaze drift for a second, not out of distraction, but reflection. The room had not become quieter. It had become clearer. He sat back again, allowing the conversation to unfold without steering it, and realized something he had overlooked for years. When people were not being tested, they revealed more than when they were. A few minutes passed like that. No tension, no performance, just conversation. Then, almost without thinking, Daniel spoke. Not to redirect, to contribute. "What would change," he said, his voice even, "if we stopped assuming the first answer was the strongest one?" The table stilled slightly, not out of hesitation, but attention. The question was different. It did not corner anyone. It opened something. A woman to his left leaned in, considering it. "It would slow us down," she said. Daniel nodded. "And?" She thought for a moment. "We might hear something better." A faint shift moved through the group. Agreement, but not automatic. Earned. Daniel leaned forward, resting his forearms lightly on the table, fully present now. "Then let us slow it down," he said. No emphasis, no command, just a direction that did not require force. The conversation resumed, but now it carried intention. People paused before responding. They listened fully before speaking, and Daniel stayed with it, not ahead of it. Across the room, Emily stood near the service station, briefly reviewing an order before handing it off. For a moment, she looked toward the dining area, not searching, just scanning the way someone does who is aware of the entire space. Her gaze passed over the table, over Daniel, and moved on. No pause. No recognition needed. He saw it anyway. And this time, he did not feel the need to hold her attention. What had needed to be said had already been said. He returned his focus to the table, to the voices now moving with more clarity, more honesty. The conversation had become something else. Not louder, not more impressive, just more real. Minutes later, as the plates began to clear and the evening naturally moved toward its close, Daniel sat back one last time, his posture relaxed but grounded. He had not dominated the discussion. He had not controlled the room. And yet, for the first time, it felt like something had actually been built there. Not an impression, not a performance, something quieter, something that would last beyond the moment. He glanced once more toward the floor, toward the movement of staff, toward the quiet presence that had shifted everything without asking for it. Then he looked back at the table, at the people now finishing their thoughts, and gave a small nod. Not to signal the end, but to acknowledge what had changed. Not around him, within him. And he did not announce it. He did not explain it. He simply stayed there, in it, as the night moved forward without needing him to lead it. By the time dessert plates were cleared, the room had softened into something quieter, more grounded, as if the evening had shed a layer it no longer needed. Conversations no longer overlapped to compete. They followed one another. Listened. Landed. Daniel noticed how different it felt to not be at the center of it, and more importantly, how little he needed to return there. He rested his hand lightly against the edge of the table, fingers still, no longer tapping out impatience or control. Across from him, one of the executives finished a point and paused, not looking at Daniel for approval, but at the group for response. It was subtle, but it mattered. Daniel gave a small nod anyway, not to claim authority, but to recognize clarity. The man continued, more confident now, building on his own thought rather than waiting for validation. Daniel leaned back slightly, allowing the moment to expand without compressing it into a conclusion. He had spent years tightening conversations into outcomes. Tonight, he let one breathe. A server passed by with a tray of coffee, the scent drifting briefly across the table. The small details, the rhythm of movement, the quiet exchanges between staff, they all seemed more visible now. Not because they had changed, but because he had. He followed the motion instinctively, and for a brief second, he saw Emily again near the far end of the room, placing a cup gently in front of another guest. The gesture was precise, almost identical to the way she had set his glass down earlier. No hesitation, no performance, just attention. She did not look toward him this time, and he did not expect her to. The absence of that expectation felt steady. He turned back to the table as someone asked a final question about timelines, something practical, grounded. Daniel answered it clearly, without elaboration, without turning it into a display. The response was enough. It did not need to be more. The group accepted it and moved on. No one lingered on his words. And for once, that felt right. Chairs shifted slightly as the dinner drew toward its natural end. Jackets were adjusted. Watches checked, but without urgency. The evening was closing, not being concluded. Daniel stood slowly when the others did. Not first, not last. Just with them. Conversations broke into smaller pairs as people prepared to leave, exchanging final thoughts, lighter now, less guarded. One of the guests approached him briefly, offering a quiet, "That was a good discussion." Daniel nodded once. "It was," he said. "No need to expand." The man smiled and moved on. Daniel reached for his coat, slipping it on with a smooth, familiar motion, but even that felt different now. Not a signal of departure, just the next step. As he adjusted the sleeve, his gaze moved once more across the room, not searching, just noticing. Emily was no longer in view, already somewhere else in the rhythm of the night. In another conversation, another table, another moment that did not require recognition to matter. He stood there for a second longer than necessary, not waiting, not expecting, just acknowledging the quiet absence. Then he turned toward the exit, walking at an even pace, neither rushed nor delayed. The door opened, and the cool night air met him without resistance. He stepped outside, the city moving around him in its usual rhythm, lights reflecting off glass, footsteps passing, distant conversations blending into a low hum. Nothing had changed out here. Not the pace, not the noise, but something inside him had shifted in a way that did not demand announcement. He paused briefly on the sidewalk, adjusting his coat, his hand brushing lightly against the inside pocket where the pen still rested. The same pen he had used to sign countless deals, countless decisions. Tonight, it had marked something else. Not an agreement. Not a transaction. A recognition. He exhaled slowly, watching the breath fade into the night air, and for the first time in a long time, he did not feel the need to move immediately. He simply stood there for a moment, present, aware, and then, without hesitation, he stepped forward into the night, carrying something quieter than confidence, but far more lasting. The city moved the way it always did, steady and indifferent, headlights gliding past in long lines, distant horns blending into a constant hum that never fully disappeared. Daniel walked without rushing, his pace measured, each step grounded in a way that felt unfamiliar, not because it was slow, but because it was intentional. He passed storefront windows reflecting fragments of his silhouette, sharp suit, straight posture, the same image he had carried for years. But tonight, the reflection did not feel like a statement. It felt like a question he no longer needed to answer. He reached the corner and paused as the light shifted from red to green, the soft click echoing through the quiet space between passing cars. People crossed beside him, some on their phones, some lost in thought, each carrying their own direction, their own purpose. No one looked at him. No one needed to. And for the first time, he did not measure his presence by whether they did. He crossed the street, the sound of his shoes against the pavement steady, almost rhythmic, until he reached the other side and slowed again, not out of hesitation, but reflection. His hand moved briefly to his coat pocket, fingers brushing against the folded receipt inside. He had not looked at it again since leaving. He did not need to. He already knew what he had written beneath his name. Not a number. Not a gesture meant to be noticed. Just a single word, small and precise. Respect. He let his hand fall back to his side, the weight of the paper insignificant, the meaning of it not. Behind him, the restaurant door opened and closed as others stepped out into the night, voices carrying faintly before dissolving into the city. The evening would continue for them the way it always did, conversations shifting, plans forming, the rhythm of routine resuming without interruption. But for Daniel, something had not resumed. It had changed direction. He continued walking, turning down a quieter street where the noise softened, where the lights were less intense, casting longer shadows along the sidewalk. His mind did not race ahead to the next meeting, the next decision, the next advantage. It stayed with the moment, with the question, not the one he had asked, the one he had been given. He replayed it once, not as a challenge, but as a mirror. Are you asking to understand, or to prove you already do? The words did not demand an answer anymore. They offered a choice. He stopped again, briefly, near the edge of a glass building, his reflection faint against the dark surface. He studied it, not critically, not analytically, just honestly. Then he gave a small nod, almost imperceptible, and stepped forward again. Somewhere across the city, in a quiet corner of the same night, Emily continued her shift, moving from table to table.